I swear, in that single breath behind the darkened wings, I thought I had just witnessed something that would change everything. Gary, Indiana. That summer night, when Michael was 7. I can still hear the wind blowing through the backstage door when I think back to that night, a night that none of us, including me, knew would become such a mysterious turning point in my brother's life. But if you ask me what made me hold my breath, what sent a chill down my spine, like I'd just walked past a secret I shouldn't have told, it all started the moment before Michael took the stage. Backstage that day was cramped, hot, and smelled of cables, velvet, sweat, and the sound of running shoes on the wooden floor. The curtain fell like a giant wall, dividing the world into two parts. One side was a storm of light, the other side was a darkness so thick that a misstep by half a beat could send my heart into freefall. I stood at the edge of the stage, my breath hitching as the sound of the audience surged in like a tidal wave. They were waiting for us, the Jackson 5, but the truth was they were waiting for Michael. Even at 7, he had an inexplicable aura, a kind of energy that seemed to come from within, not from above. But that night, that light seemed flickering. Michael stood behind me, his tiny hand clutching the corner of my shirt, not clinging like a scared child, but as if he wanted to reassure himself that I was there. He was the same lively boy as always, but today there was something different about his expression. A little dazed, a little distracted, a little swallowed by the darkness behind the stage. A nagging feeling that I couldn't explain, only that my heartbeat was starting to skip a half beat from the drum beats coming from the orchestra. I leaned down and asked softly, "Are you okay, Mike?" Michael nodded slightly. It was a nod so slight that, if I hadn't looked closely, I would have mistaken it for a slight shake of his shoulders. He didn't look at me, but instead focused on the small crack of light between the curtains, where the audience was oscillating into a chaotic pool of light and movement. I knew Michael was nervous, but I had never felt it as tense as a string about to snap. He was so quiet that I could hear my own heartbeat ringing in my ears, and that was when a cold wind blew in from the back door, causing the backstage lights to flicker. A fleeting moment, but like a signal of something about to happen. I was about to turn back to call Michael again when... thud. The sound was small, so small, but in the silence before the cue, it sounded like a hammer hitting my ribs. I didn't know what had happened, I just knew my legs jerked back, spinning me backward as if pulled by an invisible force. Michael wasn't standing straight anymore. He staggered, his tiny hand caught on the edge of the curtain behind him. Michael's right foot was bent at an odd angle, and his body tilted to the left, as if another half second would have seen him face down on the cold wooden floor. I stood frozen. My whole body stiffened as if someone had locked my joints, not because of the slip, but because of the look in Michael's eyes when he looked up. They weren't the eyes of a child who had fallen. They were too still, too deep, as if behind those eyes was a door that had opened, revealing something I had never seen before. In that moment, I felt like I was in a nameless crime scene. The unnatural silence, the flashing lights, the strange slip, and Michael's unreadable expression. It was all like a code I couldn't figure out. I had just enough time to reach out, but Michael had already placed his hand on the prop pole, steadying himself before I could touch him. A click sounded from the stage mic system. Someone whispered, 10 seconds. I turned to look at Michael. He was still, breathing heavily, but his eyes never leaving the light in front of him, as if the slip wasn't an accident, but a warning, a signal for something bigger to come. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue felt stuck to the roof of my mouth. What I felt wasn't fear. It was more like standing in front of a wire-bound door, knowing that behind it lay a secret you couldn't turn away from. 5. The count echoed through the speakers like a hammer against the walls of your brain. Michael took a deep breath. That little foot that had just slipped now stood strangely steady. 4. He clenched his fists, his fingers trembling slightly, but I saw something there. Compressed. 3. The music was about to start. 2. I opened my mouth to say, "Michael, 1. It was too late. There was no way back. There was no room to breathe. There was only the slide that had just happened, and the moment it was about to make a move I couldn't even imagine. The curtain rose, and I, the only one who had witnessed the slide, knew it was far from over. That was just the beginning of the storm. The stage light cut through the darkness like a sharp knife. The lights came on. The space in front of me was bright, but behind me was still thick as tar. I stood at the edge of the stage, just a breath away from Michael. The boy was still shaking slightly from the fall, but his body held itself together as if his instincts were stronger than his fear. The intro music started, familiar music, but tonight it sounded like a warning. For some reason, the first drum beat was so strong that it shook the wooden floor beneath me, enough to turn the air chilly. I felt like I had just stepped into the opening scene of an investigative film where everything normal had a seed of instability. Michael stepped forward, but the way he stepped was not normal. He did not immediately step into the light. Michael slowly released his hand from the prop pole, then took a single small step, so small that only those standing close to him, like me, could tell it was a balance test. The slip had clearly left him unsteady, but instead of stepping back to calm down, Michael stepped forward toward the light that stretched out before him. He had slipped. He should have been scared, but he stepped forward as if the light had called his name. I only managed to whisper, "Michael, are you really ready?" But the answer didn't come from his mouth. It came from the air. As Michael's shoes touched the edge of the carpet, I heard a tiny squishing sound. Not from the instrument, not from the microphone. It was the sound of a missed beat. A half beat. Just a half beat, and my brother would be on the wrong cue. And just as I feared, Michael stepped in too early. He spun on stage before the intro was over. My whole body convulsed, my heart clenched. I saw the timing clearly, a fatal mistake in the performing world, especially for a kid taking the lead in a song for the first time. I waited for a panicked cry from the band, for a look of bewilderment from the audience, for Michael himself to gasp, but none of that happened. Instead, the moment was warped. Michael spun so fast I didn't even know what he was doing. From his slip, I thought he'd stumble again. But no, he spun on instinct, spinning to hide the misstep. The movement was small but sharp, deliberate, and suspiciously precise for a 7-year-old. It was like a sharp turn in a crime scene, a character seemingly lost, but turning and disappearing into the shadows before anyone could see him. The audience, sitting in a position where they couldn't hear the slip, couldn't see the awkward footwork in the wings, had thought it was a planned move, an artistic turn, a stylish entrance. The first cheers, then applause, as if the planet had just unanimously agreed that it was the moment. But I couldn't applaud. I stood frozen, eyes wide, feeling like I'd just seen something no one else could see. I could feel the fear lingering in Michael's small shoulders. He wasn't turning to act, he was turning to escape. An instinctive turn, a survival reaction, to cover up his off-cue entrance. I saw both, the panic still lingering, and something beginning to light up from that fear. He turned his body, regained his balance, and straightened his back. The light fell on his face, bright, innocent, but with something hardened, like a character who had just slipped down a dark staircase, but no one but the character knew it. I was sure of one thing. Michael had just saved himself on stage in an unbelievable way. And that was the moment that took my breath away. He hadn't sung, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything but step into the light, but I could feel a change, as if the intro had become an invitation to danger. Michael had passed it, but only just enough. A small slip that could have swallowed my brother, but instead of being swallowed, he dodged it with a movement so smooth it was hard to imagine. It was like I was watching a movie where the main character narrowly escaped a trap, as if fate wanted to test Michael, and Michael responded instinctively. The music intensified. The light shifted, falling on my brother. I stood in the darkness, but my heart began to skip a beat because I knew this moment was just the beginning. Because if this 7-year-old boy had just turned a slide into a spin, what would happen when the song started? When the jumps got harder? When the lights got even brighter? I wasn't sure. All I knew was my fear wasn't over, it was just beginning. The light fell across the stage like a slash, splitting my world and Michael's world in two. On one side was the thick darkness where I stood. On the other was the bright light that gripped my brother like an interrogation. The whole space held its breath. And in that moment, I understood that the slip was not simply an accident. It was like a strange wind pulling Michael into a vortex that only he could understand. Michael stood there, his legs still shaking slightly, but his back straight like a little warrior. He was 7 years old, but his eyes were no longer those of a child. He blinked once, and in that blink, I saw a glimpse of struggle, fear, confusion, resistance, then determination, all wrapped up in less than a heartbeat. Then the music officially began. The drums beat, the bass rose. The auditorium in front of him was a sea of movement, but from where I was, right off stage, Everything was distorted, distant sounds, blinding light, and Michael stood in the middle like a secret emerging from the darkness. Michael opened his mouth but didn't sing right away. It was a moment of silence, so quiet that if you weren't standing close, you wouldn't have heard his soft breathing, but I heard it clearly. It wasn't a normal breath, it was like someone trying to swallow the lingering echo of a fateful slip. Then he sang, and immediately I sensed something was different. Michael's voice wasn't what it usually was. It was sharper, deeper, more powerful than he had been at such a young age. It was as if the slip had opened a new door in him, a kind of instinct that lay deep beneath the frailty of his 7-year-old self. He didn't just sing to the beat, he held the beat, pulled the beat, hit the beat, adjusting each section with a natural feel that adults who have practiced for years may not be able to do. And then, something happened. Only those in my position could see it. A small moment, but enough to make my heart pound. After the first verse, when entering the movement, Michael hesitated for a half second. He brought his right foot up a little slowly, a clear sign of someone who had just nearly fallen hard and had not yet fully regained his confidence. That half second felt like a siren in my head. I saw Michael's eyes scan the floor as if testing the solidity of the wood. Then, he pushed his foot forward, not a set step, not a rehearsed step. It was an improvisation. And again, only I knew it was an improvisation. The audience thought it was a technical move, a slight slide, a kind of stylish rhythm. But really, it was Michael testing his balance. He kept moving, no more shaking, no more hesitation. Michael began to bounce, jerk his shoulders, twist his wrists, the instinctive movements that would later become his signature. But that night, it was all a survival reflex, a way to keep his body in rhythm after the slide. What took my breath away wasn't the movements, but the expression that flickered across my brother's face every time the lights came on, caution cleverly disguised as confidence. The 7-year-old was acting as if nothing was happening, but underneath, under each twist, was a suppressed fear. And then, this was the moment that made me shiver. As he moved into the climax of the song, Michael made a slight turn, an adjustment turn, but the turn was perfect. So beautiful that the audience immediately burst into applause, a round of applause never heard before in a small show like this. I could hear Michael gasping for air as he finished spinning, though he tried to cover it up. And I knew something. Michael was fighting that slip every second. No one knew but me. I saw his right hand curl slightly, shake a little, then clench. I saw his eyes focus so hard it seemed like he was trying to lock all the panic into the deepest corner of his mind. I saw his small shoulders tense as he approached the edge of the stage, the most dangerous place for a child who had just slipped. The whole song was like a psychological case in the mind of a 7-year-old boy, each beat a confrontation between fear and instinct. But what kept me from looking away was the way Michael pulled the beat along with that fear, making it part of the stage, making it the rhythm. He had never done that before. No one in the audience understood why the boy sang so hard that day, danced so sharply, expressed so much. They only saw a boy shining brightly, but I, the only one who witnessed the slide, understood Michael was using fear as fuel. It was as if the slide had touched a certain string in my brother, a string that, when vibrated, created a rhythm that the whole world would later worship. And then just when I thought Michael had everything under control, something happened that almost made me fall to my knees. A shadow fell onto the stage from the right side. A member of the organizing committee accidentally stepped close to the curtain while adjusting the equipment. The shadow slightly blocked the light for half a second. Michael saw it. He was startled. His small shoulders paused. A very small pause, but enough for me to know his mentality was still unstable. I clenched my hands. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. All I could think was one thing. Michael, don't let that shadow drag you back to the moment you almost fell. And it was at that moment, the moment the shadow and the fear collided, Michael made a move that I couldn't believe. The stage lighting, which had been steady, suddenly shifted a beat when the equipment operator accidentally stepped close to the curtain. A long, dark shadow swept across the stage, covering Michael's feet, a shadow that had not been part of any performance plan. That half-second felt like a knife cutting through the air. I saw my brother flinch. Not much, no one in the audience noticed. But to me, who had just witnessed the slide that had left his body not yet fully stable, the jolt was like a red alarm. Michael stopped. Exactly one beat. Just one beat, but the beat was as long as the entire piece of music had been stretched, as if time had been deliberately stopped to see if he would stumble again. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I wanted to rush out and grab Michael, to yell at the organizers to back off, to wake someone up and let them know that my brother was standing between two opposing forces, light pulling away and darkness pulling back, but I couldn't do anything. The stage didn't allow for anything but silence. It all happened in a split second, while the music continued to hammer on the wooden floor. Michael stood there, his feet slightly bent, his arms shaking. The 7-year-old boy was being pushed back to the feeling of slipping backstage a few minutes ago. I could see it in his eyes, a moment of internal turmoil. Am I going to fall again? Am I out of sync? Will everyone notice? A feeling of suffocating vulnerability. Then, the unexpected happened. Michael didn't dodge the shadow. He didn't back away. He didn't stop performing. He continued to step into the shadow, as if he wanted to confront it head-on. As if the darkness was no longer a threat, but material for him to use. I felt the air twist around my brother like a tense spiral. Narrational element, as if he had entered a quiet zone, a zone where all the surrounding noise faded away, leaving only the sound of his heartbeat and his ragged breathing. Then Michael spun. A spin that was not part of any routine. A spin that, if you didn't know what had happened, you would have thought was the highlight of the entire performance. What was he spinning for? I'm not sure. Maybe to keep his balance. Maybe to avoid the feeling of darkness clinging to him. Or maybe, and this is what I believe, it was his way of turning fear into movement. The spin was as sharp as a silken knife cutting through the air, almost flawless. The audience had no idea it was an improvisation. They applauded, more than before, as if they had all witnessed something natural and captivating. But I stood still, my throat so dry I couldn't swallow. I knew that the spin wasn't born of confidence. It was born of fear. Fear turned into movement, movement turned into rhythm, and rhythm turned into weapons. The 7-year-old was fighting, but fighting in a way only he understood, facing with art. Michael continued his performance, but something had changed after that spin. His body no longer trembled, no longer swerved, no longer afraid of the lights. He stood firm, as if the slip and the jolt were just the spark needed to awaken something inside him. I looked at my brother's face under the light. His eyes were unusually bright. Not the innocent light of a child singing, but the light of someone who had just passed a test that no one knew about. And at that moment, I knew something deep down. Tonight, Michael was no longer just Michael. He was becoming Michael Jackson. Not because he sang better, not because he danced better, but because he overcame his fear in a way only a legend can. The music surged, and Michael sang the final verse with incredible power. There was no trace of a slip. There was no trace of a shadow that held him back. On the contrary, I felt like those two moments had lifted him up, created a momentum that allowed him to shine even brighter. The entire audience went crazy. They clapped, cheered, howled his name, a rare occurrence in such a small show. And me, I stood backstage, my hands gripping the edge of the stage curtain so tightly that my fingers turned white. I wasn't exactly moved. I wasn't exactly scared. I was in a strange state, a state that only those who witnessed the transformation of a person in that moment could understand. I felt like I was watching a case where the victim, fear, was hunted and tamed by Michael himself. No one knew this, no one but me. The audience thought they were watching a talent show, but I knew I was witnessing the moment when an icon was born, not in the spotlight, but in the darkness and a one-beat fast slip. That night, Michael walked off the stage with a small smile, as innocent as a child, but in his eyes, something had changed. A steady gaze, a confidence that was no longer fragile, a secret that only he and I understood. And in that moment, I knew the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The applause from the auditorium echoed backstage like a wave of sound that had no time to be sorted. It hit the walls, bounced off the ceiling, then rushed down my legs, running down my spine like an indescribable electric current. I heard each sound, clear, sharp, and intense. People were cheering Michael. They believed they had just witnessed a shining moment from a boy of rare talent. But I knew behind that golden light, there was a silent truth that no one but me had ever seen. Michael walked backstage, his breath still a little rapid, sweat still on his forehead. But the first thing I noticed was that his eyes were no longer the same as they had been on stage. They were softer, softer, as if he had shed an invisible layer that only he could feel. He looked at me, not smiling, not saying anything, just looking as if to ask, "Do you think I did it?" But I couldn't answer right away. Instead, my throat felt tight, dry as paper. I didn't know why. Maybe it was because I just seen a child fight fear in a way that adults sometimes can't. Maybe it was because I just witnessed a moment so unusual that it made me wonder, has a part of Michael woken up tonight? I put my hand on his shoulder. It was small, but warm, as if holding back the emotional turmoil. I squeezed Michael's shoulder a little, not to comfort him, but to make sure he was still him. Still here, still safe, still not falling. And that's when Michael let out a breath, a long, shaky breath, as if he'd released the weight he'd been holding throughout the performance. It was like the sound of a lock being unlocked, light but deep. He said softly, loud enough for only me to hear, "I thought I was going to fall again." Just one sentence. But it was enough to make me shiver, not because he almost fell, but because Michael had held that fear all the way through the show alone, and still sang, still spun, still shone, still made the room explode. I almost wanted to pull him into my arms, but I didn't. Partly because Michael didn't like to appear weak before the end of a show. Partly because I saw in his eyes something bigger than weakness, something like a surprising maturity, an ability to reassure himself, a way he turned chaos into rhythm. I leaned down slightly and whispered, "You stood firm, Mike. No one knew, only you." Michael blinked, once. Then he smiled, a small, genuine smile, but also very old, a kind of maturity that no child should have, but Michael carried it as naturally as breathing. And in that moment I realized Michael had grown a little, right there on stage in front of hundreds of people, but no one knew except me. We left backstage, heading for the dressing room. Michael's steps were lighter, more confident, as if he were walking on flat ground, not where he had nearly tripped twice just a few minutes earlier. But my eyes followed his every step, instinctively protective. I didn't want him to stumble again, not tonight, not when he had just won a silent mental battle that even I had to admit was fierce. Down the hall I could hear the audience echoing. They were still talking, still cheering, still calling Michael's name. A few people ran down the hall to get one more look at him. They didn't know that the shining kid had just experienced a slip that would have made anyone else lose their confidence. I gently pushed open the dressing room door. Michael entered first. He sat down on the bench, slowly removing his shoes. A normal movement, but today it felt like a release ritual. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, then tilted his head to look at me. "Do you think people noticed I was in the wrong place?" I shook my head. No need to say more. No one but me knew. The audience saw talent. I saw survival. The audience saw a beautiful spin. I saw a spin born of a reflex to stand. The audience saw an impressive performance. I saw a boy overcoming his fear without asking for help. Michael understood the answer in my eyes. He sighed in relief, then added, almost in a whisper, "I am glad I didn't fall." I wanted to say, "You did more," but I held back. Because perhaps you didn't need to know that tonight. My brother made an icon in his weakest moment. Years later, when the media asked me, "When did you realize Michael was destined for greatness?" I always smiled. No one knew where that smile came from. They thought I was recalling a brilliant moment on TV, a big performance, a big success, a moment of glory. But no. The moment I knew Michael would become a legend was the night a 7-year-old boy slipped backstage, the night he instinctively turned to escape his fear, the night he used his panic to create rhythm, the night he dared to step into the shadow instead of retreating from it. A night no one remembers, a moment no one talks about, a secret I didn't tell anyone for years, a moment that I held. And now, looking back, I understand that if Michael had fallen that night, things would have been different. But he didn't fall. He stood, he turned, he walked, he sang. He turned a mistake into a springboard. He turned a slip into a legend. He turned fear into strength. And so, that night, Michael didn't just avoid a fall. He began the journey to become the man the world would later call by one name, Michael Jackson.